Look at her. Master Gunnery Sergeant Dean Carver's voice carried across the entire range without him raising it, which was the point. Someone tell me why there is a girl and a pet dog on my firing line. The laughter came fast and easy, the way laughter does when the person making the joke has enough rank that laughing is the safe choice. Zara Cole did not look up. She did not stop what she was doing. She opened her notebook, uncapped her pen, and wrote the first atmospheric reading of the morning in the neat, precise hand of someone who had decided long ago that the noise other people made was not data. Shadow's amber eyes moved across the target field and did not stop moving. Subscribe now and stay until the very end. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. The laughter was still going when Carver walked the length of the firing line toward his own position, working the crowd the way a man works a crowd when the crowd is his, and has been his for 3 years, and he has no reason to believe that will change today. He was not wrong to be confident. That was the thing nobody would say out loud later, when everything had shifted and the score was on the board, and the assembled operators were doing the quiet, private work of revising what they thought they knew. Carver was genuinely excellent. 3 consecutive championships at the Joint Forces Combat Assessment Exercise was not a political achievement. It was the result of real skill, real discipline, and a natural aptitude for precision that most people who dedicated their lives to this work never approached. The problem was not his skill. The problem was what his skill had done to his ability to observe anything he had not already categorized. He reached his position and set down his case and looked back along the line at the woman at the far end. She was 22 years old, long dark brown hair loose against her shoulders, olive green sports bra, military camouflage cargo pants. She looked like she had dressed for a different kind of morning and ended up here instead. Her rifle case was worn in the way the cases get worn when they have been carried on surfaces that were not designed for carrying, in conditions that were not designed for anything comfortable. The German Shepherd at her left side was not moving, not in the restless, interested way that a working dog moves in a new environment. He was still with the specific quality of an animal that is not resting, but focusing, his amber eyes running a systematic pattern across the target field that Carver could see from 40 feet away, and dismissed in the same half-second he used to dismiss everything else about her. "What's the dog's job?" Carver asked. Not to her, to his spotter, Reyes, loud enough to carry. "Fetch the brass?" Reyes laughed. 2 other operators laughed. One did not, a quiet Army Ranger named Ortega, who was setting up the spotting scope at echo position, and who wrote something in his log without looking up. Zara continued writing in her notebook. "Hey," Carver's voice sharpened by 1 degree. Not hostile, just the voice of a man who expected acknowledgement and had not received it. "I'm talking about your dog." Zara looked up. Her expression was exactly what it had been for the past 10 minutes, present, patient, containing nothing that could be used against her. "His name is Shadow," she said, "and he's working." "Working," Carver repeated. "Doing what?" "Reading the field." Carver looked at the dog, then back at her. "He's a German Shepherd, not a ballistic computer." "I know," Zara said. She looked back down at her notebook. "He's better." The silence that followed that sentence was 3 seconds long and contained more information than most conversations. Carver processed it as arrogance, which was the available category. He did not have a category for the alternative, which was a statement of documented, tested, verified operational fact delivered without any performance behind it. He walked back to his position. He picked up his rifle. He ran through his pre-shot routine with the methodical focus of a champion who has been practicing this routine for long enough that it runs on its own. Reyes leaned close. What do you think she's actually here for? No idea, Carver said. But she's going to learn something today. From the command tower, Brigadier General Nora Vance lowered her field glasses and picked up her coffee and said nothing. She had watched the exchange. She had watched Shadow's eyes during the exchange, which had not moved from the target field once. She had watched Zara's non-response, which was not indifference, but the specific economy of someone who had learned to spend attention only where attention produced results. She had been waiting 18 months for this week. She had chosen Carver deliberately, chosen his arrogance and his credibility and his 3 consecutive championships, because she needed a witness whose professional standing was sufficient to carry the weight of what he was about to witness. And she needed that witness to start the week exactly where he was right now, certain and dismissive and completely unaware of what was at the far end of the firing line. The conversion, when it came, would be the most valuable data in the integration proposal. Not the scores, the conversion. She put her field glasses back up and watched Shadow work. The qualification round began at 800. Individual marksmanship, scored by distance and accuracy under time pressure. 10 rounds per shooter. The scoring system rewarded center impacts and penalized anything outside the primary zone. It was a standard she had designed to be achievable at the high end by exceptional marksmen and approached at the top by only the best in the room. The first 8 shooters posted scores ranging from 83 to 91 out of a possible 100. Good scores. The kind of scores that reflected years of serious work and genuine natural ability. Carver posted 94, which was the highest, and he received it with the professional composure of a man who expected 94 and was mildly disappointed it was not 96. Then Ortega called Zara's name. She moved to the line, with Shadow at her left side. She settled into her prone position with the fluid, ground-level movement that the sample script had described as flowing onto the mat, rather than lying down on it. And Carver watched her through his scope from his position, and felt the specific readiness of a man preparing to be confirmed. Shadow sat. He did not lie down. His nose began the micro-movements that looked, at distance, like the dog was simply breathing. They were not breathing. They were something that Carver had no framework for, because he had never watched the system work up close, had spent the first 40 minutes of the morning deciding it was not worth watching. Ortega was watching. He was writing in his log with the steady, unhurried attention of someone documenting something that had already happened many times and was worth recording every time, regardless. Zara fired. The shot was not the loudest sound on the range that morning. It was precise in a different way than the other shots had been precise. Cleaner somehow. More final. Like the difference between a word spoken clearly and a word spoken correctly. The impact registered. Center. Round 2 followed before the brass from round 1 had finished its arc. Carver watched through his scope, and his jaw tightened by 1 millimeter. She was not fighting the wind. That was the first thing he noticed that he could not immediately explain away. Every other shooter on the line, including him, had been in a continuous micro-negotiation with the crosswind that moved across the range in unpredictable gusts. Adjusting, correcting, absorbing the variation in real time. Zara was not adjusting. She was firing into conditions as if the conditions had already been resolved, as if the question the wind was asking had been answered before she pulled the trigger. Round 4. Shadow's shoulder pressed against her left side, a motion so small that Carver almost missed it at this distance. Zara's support hand shifted by a fraction. Round 4 impacted center. Round 7. Shadow's right ear rotated forward by 15 degrees and held. Zara's elevation changed by 1 click. A gust crossed the range 3 seconds later. The kind of gust that would have pushed round 7 3 inches left if the elevation had not already changed. Round 7 impacted center. Carver lowered his scope. He was not ready to say what he was thinking. He filed it under the available category, which was favorable conditions and lucky timing, and he held that filing in place with the particular effort of a man who has built his identity on a foundation that is showing its first crack and is applying pressure to keep it closed. The scores came back: 10 rounds, 10 impacts, 8 center, 2 center adjacent, which in the scoring system registered as 98 out of 100. The range officer read it twice, not because he doubted the number, because the range officer was a professional who understood that some numbers needed to be heard twice before the room could receive them correctly. Carver's 94 was no longer the highest score of the morning. "Lucky," Carver said. He said it quietly, to Reyes, in a tone that was doing the work of keeping the filing in place. The wind dropped on her rotation. Wait until the team scenarios. Reyes did not respond. He was watching Zara walk back to echo position, Shadow at her left side, her notebook already open again, her pen already moving, recording the atmospheric data from the session with the systematic attention of someone who understood that every data point was a lesson, and lessons were worth keeping. "She didn't even celebrate," Reyes said quietly. "What?" "She didn't celebrate the score. She just went back to writing." Carver looked at echo position. Zara was prone again, the rifle reassembled, Shadow beside her in the same still but working posture he had held since 0600. She was not reviewing the score display. She was not speaking to anyone. She was recording data, and Shadow was reading the field, and the two of them together were doing the thing they had been doing since they arrived, which was working, just working, in the specific, complete way of a system that does not require external validation to know whether it is performing correctly. It knows. It always knows. General Vance watched from the tower and said nothing and waited. She had 4 more days of this exercise and a proposal to take to the Joint Chiefs and a conversion to witness and document. She had all the time she needed. Shadow's amber eyes continued their patient, systematic sweep of the target field. He had not stopped since the truck door opened that morning. He would not stop until the work was done. Carver cleaned his rifle and told himself the word lucky one more time, and felt it hold less weight than it had the first time he said it, which was not nothing. It was the hairline fracture opening. It was the beginning of something he would not name for 3 more days, but that had already started the only way real learning starts, with a number that could not be argued with, and a dog that had not once looked away from the field. Day 2 did not start with laughter. That was the first thing Carver noticed when he walked onto the range at 0630 and found the line already populated with operators running through their morning checks. The easy, performative noise that had characterized Day 1 was quieter. Not absent, just quieter. Like a room where somebody had turned a dial down by 15%, and nobody wanted to admit they had noticed. Echo position was already occupied. Zara had been there since before Carver arrived, which meant she had been there since before 0630, which meant she had been there in the dark, with a German shepherd and a notebook, while the rest of the exercise was still deciding whether to have a second cup of coffee. Shadow was in his working posture. He had not changed it since yesterday. In Carver's experience, animals in new environments spent their first days adjusting. They explored. They reacted. They had a settling-in period before they found their baseline. Shadow had arrived with his baseline already set and had not deviated from it once, which was either the most well-trained animal Carver had seen in 20 years of this work, or something he did not have a category for yet. He was still choosing the first explanation, but the choice was requiring more effort than it had yesterday. Reyes fell in beside him. "She was here when I did my 0545 perimeter check," Reyes said. "Her and the dog. Just sitting. Sitting. Shadow was doing that thing with his nose." "What thing?" Reyes paused. "I don't know how to describe it. Like he was reading the air in segments. Systematic. Left to right and then back." He paused again. "Like a radar sweep." Carver said nothing. He set down his case and began his setup with the routine that had served him for 3 consecutive championships, and told himself that what Reyes was describing was a dog sniffing the air, which was what dogs did, and that the pattern was something Reyes was imposing on random animal behavior, because yesterday's score had made people look for explanations. The Day 2 scenario was a team movement assessment, small unit, simulated contested zone. Pop-up targets at variable ranges and intervals, scored on engagement effectiveness and communication integrity under time pressure. It was the scenario Carver had won on 2 of his 3 championship runs. He knew its rhythms. He knew where the scenario's designers hid the timing traps, and how to communicate through them without breaking the team's forward momentum. He had spent an hour the previous evening briefing his team on exactly those rhythms. He had been thorough and precise, and his team had listened with the attention of people who trusted his read. He had not spent any time thinking about echo position. The scenario order was drawn randomly. Carver's team drew position 3. Zara's unit drew position 6, last in the rotation. Carver noted this and filed it as irrelevant, and then noted that he had filed it as irrelevant, which was new. He did not usually track things he considered irrelevant. The tracking meant something was already changing in the calculus. Teams 1 and 2 ran the scenario and posted competent scores, mid-range, nothing exceptional. The kind of results that reflected good training and adequate execution, without the edge that separated good from excellent. Carver's team went third, and they were excellent. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of a unit that had rehearsed together long enough that the communication had compressed from words to signals to something closer to shared instinct. They hit 11 of the 12 target engagements effectively. The one miss was a pop-up that overlapped a communication cycle, a timing trap Carver had briefed specifically. And the miss happened anyway because the human brain, under time pressure, does not always execute what it has been told to execute. That was the irreducible variable. It was why scenarios like this existed. The score came back. Carver's team, 91.3. The exercise's existing high mark for the Day 2 scenario. He received it with professional composure and the private satisfaction of a man who had walked in expecting this outcome and gotten it. He looked down the line toward echo position and told himself that he was not checking, that he was simply looking in that direction, that the distinction mattered. Zara was in her notebook. Shadow was in his working posture. Neither of them acknowledged the score display. Teams 4 and 5 ran. Solid results. Nothing that moved the high mark. Then Ortega's voice on the range net. "Echo unit ready." A different quality of attention came over the range. Carver felt it before he could name it. The operators, who had been running their own post-scenario debrief conversations, went quieter. The exercise staff at the observation points made small adjustments in their posture. It was the collective lean forward of a group that had seen something yesterday they could not fully explain, and was now waiting to see whether it would happen again. Zara and Ortega moved into the start position, with Shadow between them and slightly forward. Carver watched from the observation area and told himself he was performing due diligence, professional observation, the kind of attention you paid to any element operating on your range. The start signal came. Shadow moved first. Not on the signal. A full 3 seconds before the signal, he shifted his weight forward, and his ears came up, and his nose began the pattern Reyes had described. The systematic sweep that moved through the contested zone air in segments. And Carver felt the first genuine crack open in the filing, because a dog that moves before the signal is not responding to the signal. A dog that moves 3 seconds before the signal is responding to something else. Something that arrived before the signal did. The signal came. Zara and Ortega moved. What happened in the next 4 minutes and 8 seconds produced a silence in the observation area that Carver had not heard on a range before. Not the silence of boredom or of professionals watching something ordinary. The silence of people who were trying to process what they were seeing, faster than it was happening, and failing. Shadow did not wait for targets to present. He oriented toward each engagement position before the pop-up mechanism triggered. Not by seconds, by fractions of seconds. A fraction that was small enough to look like coincidence the first time, and the second time, and impossible to call coincidence by the 5th time in a row. He was finding the targets in the second before they appeared, communicating their position to Zara through the shoulder pressure and ear orientation that Carver could now see clearly enough to track. And Zara was already aligned when the target presented, and the shot was already leaving, while the targeting cycle of every conventional shooter in the observation area was still in its first loop. 11 engagements, 11 hits. The final target, the timing trap that had cost Carver's team their one miss, presented in the same overlapping communication cycle. Shadow sat. He pressed his shoulder against Zara's leg and held, and Zara held, and Ortega held, and the three of them waited through a beat that lasted 4 seconds and felt longer than that. And then Shadow's ear rotated, and Zara fired, and the target that had beaten Carver's briefed, rehearsed championship team went down. 12 for 12. Carver did not breathe for the 4 seconds it took the score to process. "Echo unit score," the range officer said, and his voice had a quality it had not had on the previous 5 calls. 97.8. The silence lasted longer than 3 days ago's silence. It had more weight in it now. Yesterday's 98 had been individual marksmanship, a clean format with limited variables. Today's 97.8 was a team scenario under contested conditions, with communication requirements and timing traps, and a finale that had beaten a 3-time champion who had specifically briefed his team on how to clear it. Carver looked at Reyes. Reyes looked at the score display. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Carver said, "What is the dog doing when he orients before the target presents?" It was not a rhetorical question. It was not performed skepticism. It was a real question. The first real question he had asked about echo position since the exercise began. And the difference between a real question and a performed one was that a real question required him to admit that the answer was not already in his possession. Reyes shook his head slowly. "I don't know, Gunny." He's not reacting to the mechanism. The mechanism is silent. He's not reacting to a visual cue. He was oriented before the cover opened. Carver's voice was working through it in real time. He's reading something that tells him the target is about to appear. "Pressure change?" Reyes offered. "When the mechanism cocks, there might be a micro-pressure differential in the housing." "At 40 meters? Through ambient wind?" Reyes had no answer for that. Carver looked at echo position. Zara was already back at her notebook. Shadow was back in his working posture, amber eyes moving across the field in the systematic pattern that was not random and never had been. Ortega was writing in his log with the calm, methodical attention of someone documenting outcomes that he had anticipated. Carver walked toward echo position. He had not done this before. He had spoken across the range at Zara on day 1, with the easy projection of a man who owned the room. Walking to her position was different. It required covering ground deliberately, and every step of it was visible to the operators still on the range. And by the time he reached Echo, he had covered enough ground that turning back would have looked worse than arriving. He stopped 8 feet out. Shadow looked at him. Not aggressively, not tentatively, with the sustained, amber-eyed attention of an animal that was doing something when Carver arrived, and had not stopped doing it. Zara looked up from her notebook. "Your dog," Carver said. He stopped. That was not the right opening, and he knew it. He started again. "The pre-target orientation. He's doing it before the mechanism triggers. Explain that." Zara looked at him for a moment. She was deciding something. Not whether to answer, whether the question was genuine. He could see the assessment happening, and he stood still and let it happen, and did not add anything to it, because add-in something would have made it performance, and it was not performance. It was a real question, and he needed her to know that. "He reads pressure," she said, "not wind speed. Pressure differential. The mechanism housing creates a change in the local atmospheric pressure when it cycles. Shadow reads that change before the mechanical action completes." She looked at the dog. "He's been doing it since the first rep in training. I didn't train him to do it. He started doing it, and I learned to trust it." Carver processed that. "That's not a trainable behavior." "No," she said. "It's a natural capability. The training was mine. Learning to receive what he gives me accurately without second-guessing it." She paused. "That took longer than any marksmanship training I've ever done." Carver looked at Shadow. Shadow looked back at him without moving, without breaking his sweep, continuing to do the work while being observed, the same way Zara had been doing the work while being dismissed. "How long?" Carver asked. "To trust him completely?" "About 8 months in, I stopped arguing with his reads and started just applying them." Her voice was matter-of-fact. "The scores changed the day I stopped arguing." Carver stood with that for a moment. He looked at the score display, still showing 97.8. He looked at his 91.32 rows above it. The gap between those numbers was not explained by equipment or conditions or luck. It was explained by 8 months of a 22-year-old woman learning to stop arguing with her dog, which was the most counterintuitive training methodology he had encountered in a 20-year career, and which had just beaten his championship team on a scenario he had specifically prepared for. He nodded once. He did not say thank you. He turned and walked back to his position. Reyes watched him arrive. "Well?" "She says the dog reads pressure differentials before the mechanism triggers." Carver picked up his rifle. "And she learned to trust it without second-guessing." "That's it?" "That's all of it." Carver began his breakdown routine. "She said the scores changed the day she stopped arguing with him." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean for us?" Carver looked down the line at Echo position. Shadow's systematic sweep had not paused once during the conversation. Not when Carver approached, not during the exchange, not during his departure. The dog was working the way the work required, completely and without interruption. And the woman beside him was recording the day's atmospheric data with the same focused economy that she had brought to every moment of this exercise. "It means," Carver said slowly, "that we have been the loudest people on this range, and she has been the most effective. And those two facts are not unrelated." He did not say it loudly. He said it the way you say something when you are saying it to yourself as much as to anyone else. Reyes heard it. He did not respond. There was nothing to respond to, because it was not an argument. It was an observation that had taken 2 days and 2 impossible scores to produce, and it was the first fully honest thing Carver had said since the exercise began. Tomorrow was day 3. The iron verdict scenario. The one General Vance had designed herself and had not published in advance, and that Carver had been told by 3 separate people, was the hardest assessment scenario in the exercise's 11-year history. He had been planning to win it, the way he had planned to win everything else this week. He was still planning to win it. But the plan felt different now. It felt like the plan of a man who was no longer entirely certain what winning meant on a range where a German shepherd was outperforming his briefed and rehearsed championship team on scenarios he had specifically prepared for. Shadow's amber eyes continued their sweep. They did not require his certainty to keep working. They had never required anything from him at all. The iron verdict briefing came at 700 on day 3, and it landed on the assembled teams the way a diagnosis lands on a room that thought it was attending a routine checkup. General Vance delivered it herself. She stood at the front of the briefing room with a tablet in one hand and no notes in the other, and she read the scenario parameters in the flat, unhurried voice of someone who had designed what she was describing and had no anxiety about its severity, because the severity was the point. 12 targets, representing a dispersed hostile unit. Ranges from 900 to 1,800 meters. Variable terrain with partial concealment. 4 targets on timed movers, appearing in 3-second windows. 2 embedded non-combatant markers that would generate a penalty score if engaged. Total time limit, 4 minutes. Scoring formula. Effective hostile engagements minus non-combatant penalties, divided by elapsed time, producing a single composite number. The highest score in 11 years of this exercise was 7.4. Vance said that number without emphasis, the way you state a historical fact that is about to become obsolete and do not need to advertise it. The room absorbed the parameters in silence, not the polished professional silence of people who had processed difficult information before. The raw, working silence of operators running real-time calculations and arriving at the same conclusion from different directions. Carver arrived at his conclusion in 40 seconds. The mover targets were the problem. 3-second windows at ranges between 1,200 and 1,600 meters, under time pressure, with non-combatant markers in the adjacent zones, meant that the decision cycle for each engagement had to compress to under 1 second from acquisition to trigger break. That was not impossible. He had done it. But doing it 12 times in 4 minutes, with the specific configuration Vance had described, required a speed of environmental processing that pushed against the ceiling of what trained human cognition could reliably sustain. He knew his ceiling. He had found it in training, found it honestly, which was the only way to find a ceiling. He was close to it. He might hit it on a good run. He looked at echo position in the back of the room. Zara was writing in her notebook. Shadow was at her feet, chin on his paws, amber eyes open, and tracking the room with the specific attention he brought to new spaces. The systematic environmental read that never fully switched off. Carver had spent yesterday evening doing something he had not done in 3 years of this exercise, which was think seriously about a competitor. He had sat with his post-session data and the Day 2 score differential, and Zara's explanation about pressure differentials, and 8 months of learning not to argue, and he had worked through the implications with the methodical honesty of a man who had told himself that afternoon that he was the loudest person on the range and the least effective, and who had meant it enough to sit with the discomfort it produced. What he had arrived at, late, when the thinking had compressed down to its essential structure, was this. Shadow did not have a decision cycle. The processing step that cost human shooters the fraction of a second that compounded across 12 engagements until it filled the 4-minute window was absent. Shadow read the information and communicated it before Zara's conscious mind needed to receive it. which meant that Zara's engagement cycle started at a point that conventional shooters could not reach until several steps into their process. It was not faster reflexes. It was a shorter distance between input and output. The dog had collapsed the architecture. Carver had not told Reyes what he was thinking. He was not ready to say it out loud, because saying it out loud required accepting what it implied, which was that the score differential between the best conventional shooter on this range and the Echo unit was not a gap that could be closed by training harder or shooting better. It was a structural gap, a difference in how the system was built, and no amount of working within his existing structure was going to close it. He had gone to sleep with that understanding sitting on his chest and had woken up with it still there. Vance dismissed the briefing. 30 minutes to execution. Teams moved to their draw positions, and Carver walked to his start point with Reyes and ran through the mental rehearsal he had done 300 times. The sequencing, the communication protocol, the timing adjustments for the mover windows. It was a good plan. It was the best plan available to him given his capabilities. He executed it with everything he had. His team went second in the rotation. The run lasted 3 minutes and 41 seconds, and it felt like 41 seconds of it was the right kind of controlled, and 3 minutes was the constant, grinding management of the gap between what he needed his decision cycle to be and what it actually was under accumulated time pressure. He hit 10 of the 12 hostile targets. He did not engage either non-combatant. He missed 2 movers, both in the second minute when the pressure was highest, and the 3-second windows had started to feel like 2-second windows because the rest of the load was filling the available space. The score came back, 7.1. It was the second highest in the exercise's history. It was also 6 points lower than the Day 2 team scenario score that Echo had posted, and the iron verdict was harder than Day 2. And Echo had not run yet, and Carver stood at the edge of the range with 7.1 and the knowledge that he had done his best work and waited. Teams 3 through 5 ran. The highest among them posted 6.3. The non-combatant penalty was destroying scores across the board. The configuration Vance had designed put the marker positions in exactly the zones where the time pressure was highest and the decision quality was lowest, and the teams that avoided the penalty did so by slowing their cycle at the critical moment, which cost them on the movers, which cost them on the composite. It was a trap with no conventional exit. Either you slowed for the non-combatant and lost the mover, or you held your cycle and risked the penalty. Vance had built it to have no clean solution within the conventional processing architecture. Ortega's voice came across the range net. "Echo unit ready." Carver watched from the observation line. He had positioned himself with a clear sight line to Echo's start position, and he had his scope up, and he was watching with the complete, honest attention that he had not given this unit for the first day and a half of the exercise. He was watching the way a professional watched something he needed to understand, with no agenda except accuracy. Shadow moved into position ahead of Zara, not to the left, ahead, by 2 steps, with the forward-weighted posture that Carver now recognized as what it actually was. The dog was not following, he was leading. He had been leading the entire time, and Carver had looked at the configuration and seen a handler with a pet, and missed the entire structure of what he was looking at. Vance's start signal came. The first target was a static at 940 meters. Shadow had oriented to it before the signal completed. The full body alignment that communicated position to Zara without a word. She was already moving when the signal finished, and the shot broke at 1.1 seconds from signal, which was faster than any first-round engagement Carver had timed on this range in 3 years. The impact registered. Center. The range display updated. Carver's hands tightened on his scope. The second target was a mover. It was scheduled to appear in a 3-second window at 1,200 meters. Shadow found it before the cover opened. His shoulder pressed against Zara's left side with a pressure that Carver could see changing the angle of her support position by a fraction. And when the cover opened, Zara was already aligned, and the round was already traveling, and the target was still in its window when the steel rang. 2 for 2. The clock showed 43 seconds. The third and fourth engagements happened in a sequence that Carver would describe later as watching someone read a text that they had already memorized. The information arriving was the same information that was arriving for everyone observing. The result was different because Zara's system was processing it somewhere before the step where processing usually happened. Then the first non-combatant zone appeared. Target 7 was a hostile, positioned adjacent to the non-combatant marker, in the configuration that had broken 7 of the previous team's composites. Carver had cleared it by slowing his cycle, which had cost him the mover immediately following. Shadow stopped. Not hesitated, stopped. With the complete weight-transferring stop of an animal that had received information and had rendered a decision. He pressed his shoulder against Zara's leg, not the directional pressure that communicated position, but the flat, sustained pressure that meant hold. Zara stopped with him. Ortega stopped. The three of them held through a beat that from the observation line looked like a mistake, like a team that had frozen under pressure. Carver counted the seconds. 1, 2. The non-combatant marker completed its scripted movement. 3. Shadow's ear rotated. Zara fired. Clean engagement. No penalty. 0 cycle cost beyond the 3-second hold that Shadow had read was necessary and had communicated before the need was visible to anyone else on the range. How? Reyes said beside Carver. 1 word, spoken quietly, not to anyone. The run continued. The second mover, the one that had cost Carver on his second-minute penalty, arrived while Zara was managing a 1,400-meter static. Shadow oriented to both simultaneously, and in the language they had built together across 2 years, he communicated a sequencing decision that Zara's hands executed in an order that cleared the static in time to pick up the mover in the back half of its window. 11 engagements, 11 hits. The clock showed 3 minutes and 8 seconds. The final target was the exercise's design separator, a hostile at 1,850 meters behind the second non-combatant marker, in a configuration that Vance had placed there specifically because it had no clean solution within a conventional time budget. You could not engage it without risking the non-combatant, and you could not clear the non-combatant without the elapsed time collapsing your composite. Shadow sat. Full stop, full weight, the posture of an animal that was working a problem that required time, and had decided unilaterally that time was what it was going to take. He did not push forward. He pressed his shoulder against Zara's leg and held. And Zara held with him. And Carver watched the clock, and the clock was not kind. 3 minutes 20 seconds. 3 minutes 30. The non-combatant marker was still in the zone. 3 minutes 40. Reyes made a sound, not a word, the involuntary sound of a person watching someone else's chance disappear. Shadow's ear moved. A single rotation, forward and locked. The posture that meant now, with the specificity of a command that needed no translation. Zara fired. The round traveled 1,850 meters. It found steel. The impact sound arrived 3 seconds after the shot, a deep, resonant confirmation that bounced back across the range and landed in the silence like a period at the end of a sentence that the exercise had been building toward for 3 days. 12 for 12. 0 non-combatant engagements. 3 minutes, 47 seconds. The range officer read the composite score. Once. 9.8. The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence Carver had experienced on a range in 20 years. Not because people were processing the number. They had already processed the number. The silence lasted because processing the number and knowing what to do with the understanding it produced were two different things, and the room was in the gap between them. Vance descended from the observation tower. Carver watched her walk onto the range floor and stop in front of Zara Cole and bring her hand up in a deliberate salute. And he watched Zara return it with the precise, unhurried composure of someone who had been doing the work that warranted this for 2 years, and had simply waited for the work to be seen. Carver lowered his scope. He looked at his hands. He looked at the score display. He looked at 7.1 above 9.8 on a board that would be photographed and filed and referenced for the next decade of this exercise's history. He had been the loudest person on this range. He had 3 championships and a reputation that had been the ceiling in his own mind for as long as he could remember. The ceiling had a floor. He was standing on it. And somewhere above it, a 22-year-old woman and her dog had just posted 9.8 on a scenario that Vance had designed to be impossible, and had posted it by doing the thing that Carver had dismissed, observed, questioned, and finally, tonight, alone with his data and the score display still lit in the empty range building, was going to have to honestly reckon with. He started walking toward the command post. Not because he had been called. Because the most accurate thing he could do right now was go find General Vance and tell her that he was ready to understand what he had been looking at, and that he was asking not as the reigning champion, but as someone who had just been taught something real and knew it. Shadow watched him walk away. The amber eyes tracked his departure with a patient, systematic attention that had never once required his acknowledgement to keep working. It had never needed anything from him at all. Vance was still on the range floor when Carver reached her. She was speaking with the exercise controller, reviewing the scoring documentation, and she did not look up when he approached, which told him she had heard him coming and was deciding how to receive him. He stopped 3 feet away and waited. She finished her sentence to the controller, made a note on her tablet, and then looked at Carver with the patient evaluating the tension of a senior officer who has been watching a particular outcome develop for 3 days and wants to confirm that it has arrived before she responds to it. "General," Carver said, "I'd like to request a full briefing on the Echo Unit program." Vance studied him for a moment, not to make him uncomfortable, to read the quality of the request, whether it was the professional posturing of a man managing his reputation or the genuine inquiry of someone who had arrived at a real question through real work. "Why?" she asked. "Because I have been on this range for 3 days, and I have been wrong about what I was looking at for 2.5 of them," Carver said, "and I would rather understand it accurately than continue managing my ignorance." Vance handed her tablet to the controller and walked toward the command post without telling Carver to follow. He followed. Inside, she pulled 2 chairs to the central table and sat in one and waited for him to take the other. She did not produce a presentation or pull up a file. She looked at him directly and said, "What do you already understand?" Carver had prepared for this question, which meant he had thought honestly about what he had actually figured out versus what he was still guessing at. Shadow reads environmental data ahead of Zara's conscious processing cycle. Pressure differentials, atmospheric gradient, something that gives him a window on what the engagement will look like before it looks like that. He communicates it to her through physical signals they've built together over 2 years. She receives it without a translation delay because the language has been internalized to the point where it operates below the conscious level. He paused. The system doesn't have a decision cycle in the conventional sense. It has a response cycle. The decision has already been made by the time the conventional decision process would be starting. Vance nodded slowly. That is accurate as far as it goes. What does it not cover? The origin of the methodology. She folded her hands on the table. The program was built by a man named Thomas Becket. You may know the name. Carver did not move for 2 seconds. Master Gunnery Sergeant Becket. He disappeared from the inventory 12 years ago. He did not disappear. He went classified. There is a difference. Vance's voice was matter-of-fact. Beckett's theory, developed over 40 years of extreme long-range work, was that the limiting factor in human marksmanship and tactical engagement was not skill or equipment. It was architecture. The human processing system has a latency that compounds under pressure and cannot be trained away. You can shrink it. You cannot eliminate it. And the dog eliminates it. The dog relocates it. She paused to let that distinction land. The processing does not disappear. It shifts to a system that does not have the latency. Shadow's sensory and predictive architecture operates faster than human cognition and does not degrade under pressure the way human cognition does. The integration transfers the decision-making to the system that can handle it correctly and leaves the human responsible only for accurate execution of what the system delivers. Carver sat with that. Who found Cole? Becket found her. He has been running his program for 6 years. In that time, he has considered 11 candidates and taken 1. Vance's voice carried something that was not pride, but was adjacent to it. He said she was the first person he had encountered in 12 years who had the specific quality his methodology requires. Which quality? The ability to receive information from a nonverbal source without imposing interpretation on it. Vance looked at him directly. Most people, when they receive information they cannot immediately categorize, apply a framework to it. They interpret. They translate. They run it through the existing structure of what they already know, and they get an output that reflects the structure as much as the input. She paused. Cole does not do that. She receives what Shadow gives her and applies it directly, without the interpretive layer that would slow it and distort it. Becket called it pure reception. He said it is extraordinarily rare and cannot be taught. It can only be found and then developed. Carver thought about that. He thought about what it would mean for his own processing to remove the interpretive layer, to receive input from any source and apply it directly without running it through the framework of what he had always believed about how information worked. He could not imagine it. He could describe it, but he could not feel the interior of it, which probably told him something about why Becket had taken 1 candidate in 6 years. The proposal, Carver said. The integration proposal you are taking to the Joint Chiefs. What are you asking for? Funding and authorization for a scaled implementation of the Becket methodology across SEAL and MARSOC unit training architecture. Vance leaned forward slightly. Not mass adoption. The handler-dog integration at the level Cole and Shadow operate is not replicable at scale. Becket is explicit about that. What is scalable is the philosophy, the training culture, the understanding that the most effective element in a contested engagement is often the one you are not looking at because your existing framework has no category for it. Carver was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands. You chose me for this exercise specifically. Yes. You needed a skeptic. I needed the right skeptic, Vance said. Someone whose professional credibility is sufficient to carry weight at the Joint Chiefs when he changes his position. Someone who starts the week exactly where you started it and arrives at the end exactly where you are right now. She paused. A conversion from a true believer proves nothing. A conversion from the 3-time champion who spent day 1 questioning why there was a girl and a pet dog on his range carries the kind of credibility that moves institutional policy. Carver heard that land in him, somewhere below the professional level. She had known what he was going to say on day one, before he said it. She had built the week around it. The laughter he had generated on day one was not a liability in her proposal. It was an asset, evidence that the dismissal she was arguing against was real and representative, and the conversion she was documenting was genuine and specific. He had been a prop in someone else's design, and he had not known it, which was the most uncomfortable version of being wrong available to him. "I want to write a statement for the proposal," he said. "Not a commendation. A statement. What I said, what I assumed, what it cost me an observation, and what I saw when I finally looked correctly." Vance held his gaze. "That is exactly what I need." "I'm going to include the day one comments." "I was hoping you would." Carver stood. He felt the particular weight of someone who has been carrying the wrong thing for 3 days and has just set it down, and is adjusting to what his hands feel like without it. "One more question." "Go ahead." "Beckett. Is he reachable?" Vance's expression shifted by a fraction. "He does not come to formal briefings. He does not take meetings with people he has not vetted personally." She paused. "But he reads the program documentation. He will know what happened here this week. What will he make of it?" "He will make of it exactly what it is," Vance said. "Evidence that the system works in public conditions against the most skeptical available audience." She looked at Carver steadily. "And he will note who the skeptic was and what he did when the evidence became undeniable." Carver nodded once. He left. He found Zara at echo position, which was where she always was. Shadow was in his working posture, amber eyes running the field, the systematic sweep that did not require a range to be active to proceed. Ortega was reviewing his log at the adjacent position. Carver stopped 10 feet out. Shadow looked at him. The assessment was the same as it had always been. Unhurried, amber, complete. "I read through the scoring data from day 1 and day 2 last night," Carver said. "Your first round on day 1 qualification. The wind shift on round 7. Shadow read at 3.2 seconds before the gust arrived at the firing point." Zara looked up. 3.1, she said. "I logged it at 3.1. "I had 3.2 on my scope timer." "I'll check my data against yours." It was such a specific, technical exchange that Carver almost smiled. He had walked over to deliver an apology, and they were debating a 1/10 of a second on a pre-shot wind read. But that was the thing, he realized. That was the nature of the work she did. It was precise, down to a 1/10 of a second, and it had been precise down to a 1/10 of a second since before he knew her name. And his not knowing her name had not changed the precision by any measurable amount. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not for losing, for what I said on day 1. He looked at Shadow. "And for what I said about him." Zara was quiet for a moment. "Shadow doesn't hold it against you," she said. "He read you accurately from the beginning. He knows the difference between a threat and a mistake." "What did he read?" "Someone who had been right for so long that being wrong felt like an attack." She said it without judgment, the way she said everything, as information rather than indictment. "He didn't growl at you, he just waited." Carver looked at the dog. Shadow looked back at him with the amber eyes and the sustained, unhurried patience of an animal that had been waiting for this conversation since day 1, and had never once been in a hurry about it. "Can I ask you something?" Carver said. "Yes?" "The final target today, the 1,850-meter hold. He made you wait 40 seconds. Into the back end of your time budget, into a zone where the composite was compressing." He paused. "Did you trust it?" Zara looked at Shadow. The dog's tail moved once, slow and deliberate. "I have not questioned a hold in 14 months, she said. "The last time I questioned one, I overrode it and missed." She looked back at Carver. "Shadow held me off a target that I had a clean line on, and I fired anyway because I thought I knew better." She was matter-of-fact about it, no performance in it. "He was right. The non-combatant marker moved into the zone 0.8 seconds after I fired. I would have taken the penalty." She paused. "I wrote in my log that evening, 'Do not argue with the dog.' I have not argued since." Carver stood with that. He thought about everything in his 20-year career that he had executed by trusting his own read over any external input. The accumulated reinforcement of being right enough times that the internal framework had started to feel like the only reliable instrument available. He thought about what it would cost to replace that certainty with something else. Not with doubt, with a different kind of certainty, one that included the capability of a partner whose read was better than his and required him to receive it without argument. He thought about the composite score his team had posted on the non-combatant scenario. The 91.3 that was the second highest in the exercise's history and was now the fourth highest in this week's results. "I'm writing a statement for General Vance's proposal," he said. "A full account of this week, including day 1. Zara did not react with relief or gratitude. She received it the way she received everything, as information. "Good," she said. "Is there anything you would want included that I might not think to mention?" She thought about that for a moment. "Write about the silence," she said. "The first day. The fact that neither of us spoke, and I still outperformed everything on the range. Write about what that means, about what communication actually is, and how much of what we call communication is actually noise." She looked at Shadow. "He has never said a word to me. He has never needed to. Everything I need to know comes through the language we built without words." She paused. "That's the whole program. That's the thing Beckett spent 40 years trying to get someone to understand." Carver looked at the dog. Shadow held his gaze with the patient amber eyes that had been reading this range since before Carver arrived and would still be reading it after he left. The systematic attention of a system that did not require recognition to function and had never once asked for it. "Understood," Carver said. He turned and walked back toward the command post and did not look back. Because looking back was what you did when you were uncertain about the direction you were moving. And he was not uncertain. He had been uncertain for 3 days, and it had cost him 2.5 days of accurate observation and the specific, irretrievable opportunity to see something clearly from the beginning. He was not going to be uncertain about this anymore. He was going to write the most honest document of his career. He was going to put his name on an account that made him the cautionary tale. And he was going to do it because the only way to pay for what you got wrong was to make the payment visible enough to be useful. Behind him, Shadow's amber eyes resumed their sweep. The range was quiet, and the work continued, the same way it had continued since before anyone was watching, and the same way it would continue after everyone had gone. The work did not require an audience. It never had. That was the point. That had always been the point. Carver wrote through the night. Not the polished institutional language of a formal military assessment. He had started that version at 2,100 and abandoned it at 2,140 because the polished language was doing what polished language always did, which was create distance between the writer and the thing being described. And distance was exactly what this document could not afford. He started again. He wrote the way he talked when he was being honest, which was directly and without decoration, and the first sentence he wrote was the one that cost the most. On day 1 of the Joint Forces Combat Assessment Exercise, I told my spotter that a female lieutenant and her dog had no business on my firing line. He wrote for 4 hours. He wrote about the laughter and what it was for. He wrote about the score on day 1 and the word lucky and the specific effort it had taken to keep filing the evidence as coincidence when the evidence kept failing to cooperate. He wrote about walking to echo position on day 2 and asking the first real question he had asked about the unit in 2 days, and what Zara had said about 8 months of learning not to argue. He wrote about sitting with his day 2 data that evening and arriving at the understanding about decision cycles and what it meant that the gap between echo and every other unit on the range was structural, not correctable through the architecture he had spent 20 years building. He wrote about the iron verdict. He wrote about 7.1, which was the best score of his career on that scenario, and about 9.8, which was not better than his best by a margin that fit inside the category of talent or luck or favorable conditions. He wrote about what a 2-point gap on a composite scoring formula actually represented at the tactical level, the number of engagements it translated to, the number of lives it represented in a real deployment. Because the point of the document was not to process his own humiliation, but to make the operational stakes of the program's capabilities legible to the people who controlled its resources. He wrote about Shadow. He spent 40 minutes on Shadow, specifically because Shadow was the part that would be hardest for the Joint Chiefs to receive without the right framing. Not because the evidence was unclear, but because the evidence required the reader to accept that the most effective tactical element in the week's assessment was a German Shepherd. And human beings in positions of institutional authority had a specific and well-documented resistance to accepting that the most effective thing in a room was not the thing that looked most like them. He wrote it anyway. He wrote it directly. He wrote that Shadow's pre-target orientation preceded mechanism trigger by an average of 2.8 seconds across 12 observed engagements. That his non-combatant clearance read on the final iron verdict target was made with a margin of accuracy that no human spotter on the range had matched across any equivalent scenario in 3 years of this exercise's history. And that the system he formed with Zara Cole was not an anomaly, and was not luck, and was not a performance for the assessment. It was the output of a methodology developed over 6 years by the most rigorous and least publicized marksmanship integration program in the current military inventory. And the week's data was the public record of what that methodology produced under real assessment conditions. At 01:30, he wrote the final paragraph. He had been thinking about what Zara had said about the silence, about how everything she needed came through a language built without words, about how much of what they called communication was noise. He wrote about that. He wrote that the program's deepest lesson was not about marksmanship or canine integration or the specific technical capabilities of Shadow's sensory architecture. It was about what happened when you removed the noise from a system and let the most capable element in that system do its work without interference. Zara Cole had scored 9.8 on the hardest scenario in 11 years of this exercise, while being dismissed, mocked, and professionally invisible to the people around her. The dismissal had not affected the score. The score had existed independent of the opinion surrounding it, waiting to be documented. He sent the document to Vance at 01:42 and went to sleep. Vance read it at 02:15. She read it twice. Then she forwarded it to Admiral Reyes at Pacific Command with a single line of accompanying text. "This is the conversion document I told you I would get you. Read the last paragraph first." The final day of the exercise was administrative, documentation and equipment recovery, and the formal closing formation that Vance had designed to close a chapter she had been building toward for 18 months. The teams assembled on the range floor at 0900, all of them, exercise staff and operators and support personnel, the full population of the week. Carver stood in his position in the formation, with Reyes to his left, and looked straight ahead, and felt the specific quality of someone who had submitted the most honest document of their career 8 hours ago, and was now in the process of accepting what that meant for how they were received by the people who read it. Vance opened the formation without ceremony. She read the iron verdict results for the record. She announced the proposal authorization and the Joint Chiefs briefing scheduled for the following Thursday. She said none of this with the inflection of triumph, because she was not a person who required triumph. She was a person who required results, and the results were documented, and the proposal was authorized, and the briefing was scheduled. Then she said, Master Gunnery Sergeant Carver submitted a formal statement for the integration proposal documentation this morning. I am going to read one paragraph of it. Carver had not expected this. He had submitted the document to Vance in the understanding that it would go into the proposal package and be read by the people who needed to read it. He had not expected it to be read aloud in a formation. He stood still and looked straight ahead and said nothing. Vance read the final paragraph. She read it in the same flat, unhurried voice she used for everything, because the words did not need her emphasis. They had their own. She read the sentence about the noise, and the sentence about the most capable element, and the sentence about the score existing independent of the opinion surrounding it, and waiting to be documented. When she finished, the formation was quiet. Reyes, the side Carver, was not looking at him. He was looking at the range floor, in the direction of echo position, and his expression had the quality of a man who was thinking something true for the first time, and was not entirely certain what to do with it yet. Vance closed the document file. She looked at Zara. Lieutenant Cole, come forward. Zara moved from her position with Shadow at her left side. She stopped in front of Vance with the composed, present bearing she had brought to every moment of the week, unchanged by the formation's attention or the weight of what was happening. Vance reached into her uniform pocket and produced a folded document. Program Integration Authorization, signed by Admiral Reyes, Pacific Command, effective immediately. The Beckett Continuation Program is formally authorized for expanded implementation across SEAL and MARSOC unit training architecture with full resource allocation. She held it out. You will coordinate the implementation timeline with my office, beginning next week. Zara took the document. She did not look at it. She looked at Vance. Thank you, General. Don't thank me, Vance said. You produced the data. The data made the decision. She paused. Thank the dog. Something moved in Zara's expression. Not a smile exactly, but the movement in a face when a thing that has been true for a long time has finally been said by someone with the authority to make it official. She looked down at Shadow. Shadow looked back at her with amber eyes, and his tail moved once. The slow, deliberate motion that meant something had been settled correctly. Good boy, Zara said quietly. The formation was dismissed. The range began its final breakdown, equipment moving toward vehicles, teams clearing positions, the organized entropy of an exercise closing down. Carver stood at the center of it and did not move immediately because there was something he needed to do before the week ended, and the opportunity to do it was already contracting. He found Zara at echo position, her final item. She was closing Shadow's lead line, the last act of the exercise's working configuration, the formal end of the deployment posture that the dog had maintained since the truck door opened 5 days ago. Carver stopped in front of them. Shadow looked at him with the amber eyes and did not move, which was the most welcoming response Shadow had offered him all week, and Carver had enough context now to know that. I submitted the statement, he said. I heard General Vance read from it. She took the last paragraph. I thought it might be the wrong choice for a formation. It wasn't. Zara looked at him. It was the right choice because you meant it, she said. People can hear the difference. Carver stood with that for a moment. He looked at Shadow. I want to ask you something I should have asked on day one. Okay? His name. Shadow. He paused. Why that name? Zara looked at the dog. The expression on her face was the first fully open expression Carver had seen from her in 5 days. Not guarded, not measured, just present. Beckett named him. He said the most dangerous thing on a battlefield is the thing that moves through the space you're not watching. He said a shadow is what exists in the place where light has been blocked by something solid, and that the most important tactical information is usually in the shadow of whatever you're already looking at. She looked back at Carver. He said if I was going to build a system around the dog's name should remind me what we were doing. Carver looked at Shadow. Shadow looked back at him with the amber eyes that had been reading the space Carver was not watching since day one. The systematic assessment that had been running independent of whether Carver looked at it or not. I spent 3 days looking at the wrong thing, Carver said. Yes, Zara said, but you stopped. Is that enough? She thought about that honestly. It is if you stay stopped, she said. The failure is not the 3 days. The failure would be if the 3 days became the permanent position. She looked at Shadow. He doesn't evaluate past behavior. He evaluates present behavior. He decided something about you this morning that he did not decide on day one. What did he decide? That you were worth talking to, she said simply. He does not waste his attention on people who are not going to use it correctly. He made his assessment, and he updated it when the data changed. She paused. That is the whole methodology, actually. That is what Beckett spent 40 years trying to teach. You read what is in front of you. You hold the read accurately without distortion. And when the data changes, you update. Without ego. Without attachment to the previous position. You update. Carver nodded slowly. He extended his hand toward Shadow, palm up, the offering posture that he had not known was the correct one until he had watched Zara do it earlier in the week, and understood it was not deference, but accuracy. Shadow pressed his nose against Carver's palm and held it there for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was, in Carver's experience of the week, exactly as long as Shadow held contact with something he had decided was real. Vance found him afterward, alone at the cleared echo position, looking at the ground where the shooting mat had been. Your statement, she said. Reyes forwarded it to the Joint Chiefs pre-read package this morning. Carver looked at her. Before the briefing? They asked for supporting documentation from the exercise. I sent them yours. She paused. Specifically yours, not the composite assessment. Yours. She looked at the cleared position. There is going to be resistance in the room Thursday. There is always resistance when a proposal asks people to accept that the most effective element in an engagement configuration is something they do not have a category for. She looked at Carver. I need someone in that room who was the resistance last week and is not the resistance this week. Someone who can speak to the interior of the change. You want me at the Joint Chiefs briefing. I want you presenting the conversion statement in person. She paused. Not as a cautionary tale. As a credibility transfer. You are the person in that room whose professional history gives the proposal its most important endorsement. Specifically, because you started this week exactly where the people on the other side of the table are going to start Thursday. Carver was quiet for a moment. He thought about standing in front of the Joint Chiefs and reading the sentence about a girl and a pet dog on his firing line. He thought about what that cost and what it produced, and whether the production was worth the cost. He thought about 9.8. He thought about the final target at 1,850 meters, and Shadow sitting and holding through 40 seconds of compressing time budget, and being right. He thought about Zara's voice saying, "I have not questioned a hold in 14 months," flat and factual, and carrying the full weight of 14 months of choosing trust over certainty. "Yes," he said, "I will present it." Vance nodded once. She walked away without ceremony, because ceremony was not her language, and had never been. She had built this week to produce a specific outcome, and the outcome had been produced. And the next stage was already in motion, and there was no time to spend on conclusion when the work was continuing. Carver stood at the cleared echo position for another minute. He looked at the range. 5 days of this ground had produced something that would take the proposal Thursday, and then the implementation timeline, and then whatever followed the implementation. And all of it had started from a 98 on a qualification round that he had filed as lucky, and a German shepherd whose systematic sweep of the target field he had characterized as a dog sniffing the air. He had been wrong about what he was looking at. He had been wrong in the specific, confident, thorough way that a person was wrong when they had been right for long enough that the category for being wrong had stopped being available. And the thing that had been right while he was wrong had not waited for him. It had not adjusted its performance to his perception, or slowed down to be recognized, or made noise to demand acknowledgement. It had simply worked, at the level the work required, in the silence that the work produced. And it had let the numbers speak for everything the words could not say quickly enough. 3 days later, in a room at the Pentagon that held 12 people and the weight of institutional policy, Carver stood up and read from his statement. He read the first sentence first, because the first sentence was the one that cost the most, and the one that mattered most, and because a man who was not willing to read the first sentence in public had not actually earned the rest of it. On day 1 of the Joint Forces Combat Assessment Exercise, I told my spotter that a female lieutenant and her dog had no business on my firing line. He read for 11 minutes. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when the person speaking has paid the price that earns the kind of attention that actually changes something. When he finished, Admiral Reyes asked 2 questions and approved the proposal. Shadow never knew about the room at the Pentagon. He did not need to. He had made his contribution on a range in California in 5 days of work that required nothing from him except accuracy. And accuracy was what he had given, without noise, without ceremony, without any requirement that the people around him recognize it before it was real. It had always been real. That was the point. That was the whole lesson. The most important thing in the room does not become important when you look at it. It is important before you look, while you look away, and after you have finally looked and understood what you were missing. It does not require your attention to exist. It only requires your attention to be used correctly. Shadow had been working since the truck door opened. He had never stopped. And the score had been waiting, patient as amber eyes, certain as 40 seconds of held breath at 1,850 meters, for the moment when the right people finally looked at the right thing and told the truth about what they saw. That moment had come. The truth had been told. And nothing that followed could unmake what the data had already proven, permanently and without appeal. The work had spoken, as it always does, as it always will.